So, why is it that some horoscopes are spot on and others just really miss the mark? Either they just don't fit your experience or they just don't make sense. Why is that? I want to answer that from the perspective of an astrologer. There's several reasons why. I'm going to try to cram this in 10 minutes. It's kind of a lot of information. I did go into it in more detail on my blog, but just to get into it really quickly, one is that a typical newspaper or online horoscope is really only looking at the sun sign or the rising sign. So that's one small part of your chart. So when you get an astrology chart done, the astrologer is looking at where every planet was at the moment of your birth. And we gather information from the relationship between the different planets in your chart. And so when we're looking at where the current planets are, we're looking at what planets and houses they're hitting in your birth chart. But for that information to be accurate, we need an exact birthday, birth time, and birthplace. Now, there are ways to look at the chart if you don't have the exact time. They're not quite as accurate, and then in ancient times, they did something called horary. So if they didn't have your birthday, birth time, birthplace, they looked at the moment you asked the question, and they used special techniques in order to figure out whether something was going to happen or not happen, or the timing of a particular thing. I won't get too deep into that because it's complicated, and a lot of astrologers don't practice horary because it's an art unto itself. But basically, we need to put you in the correct place and time. And some of you are early risings or late risings, right? So you could be born in that 5 minute window when the rising sign changes or when your sun sign changes. And so a horoscope might not be perfectly accurate for you because, you know, maybe like there's a difference between like an Aries rising and a Taurus rising, for example, right? So we need to know the exact degree and which one of those you are. Um, and so the birth time and birthplace and the birthday are going to give us that. So I've kind of touched on this, but degrees matter in astrology. So the relationship between the planets. So if the sun is 120 degrees away from Venus, that's considered to be a very harmonious aspect. So you would probably have an easier time in your relationships expressing love to others and to yourself. You're kind of there's a harmony there between those planets. Versus if you have Venus and Saturn square, maybe you have a more challenging time in relationships, because so that knowing those degrees is important to see whether the planets are working together or whether they're opposing each other or if they're in a combative, intense relationship. So we kind of need to know that. Okay. And um, I won't get too much into it, but in ancient times, astrologers were mathematicians. And there's a reason for that because the foundation of astrology is math. It gets very complicated and involves a lot of geometry and trigonometry. And to be honest, I've looked at some of the books that explain the kinds of equations used in order to generate the charts, and it's super complicated. That is why, for the last 100 years or more, we've had tables. Well, actually, for a few hundred years, we've had astrology tables to help us like do this a lot faster. And now we have computers, which makes it super fast. But in ancient times, they had to do a whole lot of math in order to figure out your chart. So, speaking of ancient times, traditional and Hellenistic astrology, and somewhat in modern too, not all of the chart is activated at the same time. Certain planets or certain houses are going to be more um, impactful at a particular time in your life. And so a full astrology reading is going to take that into account, like which themes are active in your chart right now. So when we're doing a monthly or weekly horoscope, we don't have that context. We don't have that information to see like, oh, okay, this is a Venus year for you, and your relationships are going to be very prominent, or aspects to your natal Venus are going to be really important, right? Versus another time where maybe your 10th house is activated, and that's your career and your reputation house. And so we don't have that context when we're doing just a basic rising sun sign horoscope. We do in the sense of the outer planets. We can look and see what house the outer planets are in. If you know your rising sign, you can read the horoscope for the rising sign, and you can at least know, okay, where is Saturn impacting my chart right now? Where is Pluto impacting my chart? So in that sense, we can look at that. But for the more kind of complex calculations and charts that we would do in a full astrology reading, we don't have access to that because we're dealing with limited information in a weekly or monthly horoscope. So this is also important. In line with that information, does the astrologer believe that the planets are deterministic, or do they believe that you have free will? That's going to color how they interpret it, as also whether they practice modern psychological astrology or whether they practice very traditional astrology. Because you would look at an aspect and say, maybe someone might see Saturn and Mars impacting your seventh house, and they might say, oh, you're going to get a divorce. Versus someone who takes a more spiritual psychological approach might see that, whatever that aspect is, and say, well, right now is a time when you need to look at how you're interacting with your partner. How are you communicating with them? What is your relationship like? Are you willing to put in the work that is required in order to, have a better relationship? These are some themes and things to be thinking about so that you can understand how you want to move forward, right? And you can make that decision of whether you can grow and expand and um, continue this relationship, or whether this relationship has served its purpose and you can no longer work together as a unit, right? So it's a different approach to say in a finite way, this is absolutely going to happen, versus, well, these are themes, but you have the power of choice in terms of looking at whether or not this relationship ends. So that's important. The astrologers' philosophy and their perspective on how the planets work and how the aspects work, and what their sort of mental framework is. Also, another thing is that there are a lot of different predictive methods that can be used. So when we're doing a full astrology reading, we're not just looking at the transits, where the current planets are and how they're hitting your chart. We're also looking at other things. We're looking at how you've grown as a person and how things have evolved. And so that would look at things like progressions and solar arcs. We might look at solar returns, which is like from birthday to birthday, and that shows themes of your year. So there's different predictive methods that an astrologer could be using. And when we're doing a general horoscope, you're mainly looking at transits because you don't have access to all those other predictive methods, because you don't have the birth time to be able to, and birthday, to be able to get more information, right? Lastly, and this is a slightly more obvious one, is that sometimes horoscopes, like say in a magazine or a newspaper, or if like a fashion magazine in particular, might not be written by an actual astrologer. They might be written by a writer who just kind of looked up a few things about astrology and just, put something out there. And there are people who are scammers, who will pretend to know things about astrology, but they really don't know what they're talking about. Generally, most professional astrologers have been studying astrology for years and years and years, and they've looked at hundreds of charts, thousands of charts, really thousands of charts. And that can impact things. Are you getting information from someone who's still kind of new and they haven't looked at lots and lots and lots of charts? They might not have the experience and breadth of understanding to really interpret how these planets are interacting with a certain amount of depth. So I hope that helps you to understand a little bit more about astrology and how it works. Thanks so much. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video.